follows a pattern that is used over and over and over again in public discourse. In this video, we're going to take a look at the fifth type of a substantive warrant, specifically argument by parallel case. And as we do that, we're going to remind ourselves about the tests that we use for evaluating warrants to see whether or not a move of reasoning is logically sound. And we'll see what form those tests take when we're talking about arguments from parallel case. According to Brock-Reedy and Enninger, in an argument from parallel case, the arguer uses the warrant that the instance reported in the data bears an essential similarity to a second instance in the same category. Argument from parallel case is referred to in Inch and Tudor's textbook on argument as a literal analogy. It compares two objects of the same class that share many characteristics and concludes that a known characteristic that one possesses is shared by the other. Parallel case reasoning is going to resonate with our previous discussions of generalization and classification reasoning, in that we're dealing with a class, a set of similar things. The things can be objects, persons, events, concepts, whatever. The idea is that within this class, we have one specific member, and the member of that class is going to have characteristics that position it as part of that larger class. And then we have another member of the class, and it too is a member of that class because it has the same defining characteristics. So parallel case reasoning is going to operate in the following way. What's going to be true for one member of that class will be true for another member of that class. We're not making a claim about the class as a whole. We're making a claim that directly compares one member to another member. Here's a simple example to see how this works. Let's imagine that a friend of yours is trying to decide whether or not they want to enroll in a certain political communication class in the fall semester. And you were to argue to your friend, Dr. Klein's political comm class will be amazing. And they ask you why. And you provide some data. Dr. Klein's argument and advocacy class is amazing, and he's offering the political communication class in the fall. So how do we get from the evidence that Dr. Klein's argument and advocacy class is amazing to the claim that his political communication class that's coming up in the fall will also be amazing? What's true for argument and advocacy is also going to be true for political communication. And why is it that what's going to be true for this class is going to be true for another class? Well, the implied backing may be that the classes share the same professor, they share the same approach to course design and assignments and so forth. So what's true for the class that's happening this summer is also going to be true for the class that's being offered in the fall. Okay, I'll stop patting myself on the back now. But how could we test an argument like this? Let's go to the tests that we should be familiar with now after several videos in this series. We have three general categories of tests of reasoning that are going to apply to any argument prototype. First, a test of quality. In the case of a parallel case argument, do the cases being compared belong to the same class of objects? Then we need to apply a test of quantity. Are the similarities sufficient in number to make a sound comparison? And finally, we'll need to apply a test of opposition. Are there important differences between the objects that make the proffered comparison unreasonable? Let's take these tests and apply them to the example that we just went over. If we look at the test of quality in this case, we need to determine if the argument and advocacy class belongs in the same class of objects as the political communication class. And if you are familiar with the context of disagreement in University of Missouri communication classes in the political communication area, then you might have a sense that, okay, the test of quality may in fact be operable on a couple of levels. On the one hand, they belong to the class of objects of University of Missouri classes that are taught in the political communication area. Argument and advocacy is in that class of classes, and political communication is in that class of classes. You might also consider a different class yet, which is the class of classes offered by Dr. Klein. And so argument and advocacy is a class that's taught by Dr. Klein, so is political communication. Then we have to apply the test of quantity. Okay, so they may have a basic similarity that puts them in the same class of objects, but are the similarities between these two cases sufficiently similar that what's going to be true for one is going to be true for another? Now, this is where the backing would need to come into play. You would need to establish, in order to justify the reasoning in parallel case, that they have enough similarities that you can make that one-to-one comparison. So, we have a number of similarities here. The same professor is teaching the class. The classes that are taught by that professor have the same overall approach to the way that the course is designed, the way that assignments are presented for students, as well as a variety of other specific elements that, over the course of your conversation with your hypothetical friend, you might be able to point out, well, he does these kinds of things in the argument and advocacy class, and chances are pretty significant that he's going to be doing similar kinds of things in the political communication class. So if we rack up the number of similarities, the same professor, the same area of the communication major, same approach to course design, same approach to the use of assignments, same kind of classroom or online class dynamic. So there's a number of different similarities. So it may potentially lead one to think that if this class is amazing, then the class that's going to happen in the fall will be similarly amazing. But then we have to bring in the test of opposition, and that is, are there any significant differences that would lead one to hold that, okay, maybe if we assume the argument and advocacy class is amazing, does that necessarily mean that the political communication class will be amazing? Well, this is where, again, we would need to think about the differences in terms of the context of disagreement where this parallel case argument is being made. So you might imagine, for instance, that there are going to be some significant differences between the classes. On the one hand, argument and advocacy is much more skills-based in terms of applying specific skills to be able to analyze and evaluate arguments, and then to be able to put together and present arguments. Whereas political communication is a class that, while some of those kinds of things are going on, the content is much more subject area based. So you might imagine then, for instance, if you are someone who really isn't into politics, you might find the argument and advocacy class amazing because, hey, I'm developing the skill set that's going to be important for my career, and there's some content in the class that I'm not really digging, but overall, the primary emphasis is something that I'm finding really amazing. However, that person who's really in it for the skills development and the transferability of those skills might not necessarily find the political communication class amazing if what they find is, well, this is really focusing a lot on the nature of politics and how communication works within politics, and that's not something I'm really into. So applying that test of opposition, then while we've got enough similarities to establish that these two classes might be in the same class of objects, the number of overall similarities might not necessarily overcome that test of opposition. If we have enough significant differences to establish that one is significantly different than the other one, then the parallel case argument isn't going to work. Now, we can see that particular test of opposition applying in a recent real-world public policy argument that should be familiar to you if you've seen previous videos in this series. In October of 2015, President Barack Obama had to address the nation following a tragic school shooting at a community college in Roseburg, Oregon. And a big part of what he attempted to do in that speech was to make a case that the time is now for the United States to consider what he referred to as common sense gun control legislation in order to make access to guns more difficult, thereby lowering the chances that somebody who shouldn't have a gun can get easy access to a gun and commit this kind of violent crime. At one point in the address, he engages in some parallel case argument to establish that the kind of legislation he has in mind actually has worked empirically very well in the past for some familiar allies of ours. Let's take a look at the argument.
So the notion that gun laws don't work or just will make it harder for law-abiding citizens and criminals will still get their guns, it's not borne out by the evidence. We know that other countries, in response to one mass shooting, have been able to craft laws that almost eliminate mass shootings. Friends of ours, allies of ours, Great Britain, Australia, countries like ours. so we know there are ways to prevent it.
If we use the Toulmin diagram to map out Obama's parallel case argument, we can get a sense of how the reasoning is intended to work in this case. Obama makes the claim that stricter gun safety laws in the United States have the capacity to virtually eliminate mass shootings. And the data that he provides in order to back up this claim is that strict gun safety laws in Great Britain and Australia have virtually eliminated mass shootings. The implicit warrant linking these cases is essentially what's true for these advanced nations like ours, Great Britain and Australia, would be true for the United States. And at one point, if you'll recall in the video, he actually provides some explicit backing that these are countries that are just like us. He seems to actually be rather surprised that people don't see this comparison, right? So what we need to do is apply our tests of reasoning to see if this parallel case is going to work. So, test of quality. Do the cases being compared belong to the same class of objects? Well, Obama explicitly places Great Britain and Australia on one side and the United States on the other side as within the general class of advanced nations, and specifically he makes reference to us as allies. So, the test of quality has at least a minimal success. Let's get to the test of quantity. Are the similarities sufficient in number to make a sound comparison? Now, in this case, you'll notice that President Obama doesn't provide a whole lot of explicit backing to establish why Great Britain and Australia on the one hand and the United States on the other hand are sufficiently similar. That's what's going to be true for those other nations will be true for ours. So we need to think about the context of disagreement and try to unpack how President Obama is presuming that his audience of American citizens is going to be able to infer these similarities. So if we think about what's often referred to as advanced nations in contemporary public discourse, we can think, for instance, about political system. All of these nations are representative democratic republics with civil liberties as well as government that's elected of, by, and for the people. In terms of economics and political economy, we are industrial and information economy capitalist systems. So economically as well as politically, there's a lot of similarities. In terms of popular culture and language, there are a number of similarities as well. So again, note that President Obama is not delineating all of these. It's up to the audience to infer them in this particular instance. But so far, it seems like there are a lot of similarities between Great Britain and Australia on the one hand, and the United States on the other hand. But then we get to the test of opposition. Are there important differences between the objects that make the proffered comparison unreasonable? This is an area where critics of Obama's argument have been pretty vociferous, and to some extent they have a pretty valid point. Because if there is one very significant difference between Great Britain and Australia on the one hand and the United States on the other, it's that the United States has a Second Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This has been interpreted in U.S. constitutional law, especially in recent years, as the Constitution protecting the right of citizens, as private citizens, to own personal firearms. And this constitutional protection has been a basis for arguing against many of the kinds of gun control legislation options that President Obama and others have offered up. And so one might argue that an important thing that makes us different is that we need to be very, very careful that the laws that we implement do not violate the right to keep and bear arms. Because if a law violates the Constitution, the law can and should be overthrown by the Supreme Court. And these other nations do not have a right to keep and bear arms baked into their constitutions. So that's a significant difference. Another significant difference, although this one isn't necessarily offered up by gun control opponents, but I think is worth thinking about, is that the United States for centuries has had a real cultural relationship with the gun. It's been part of the mythological narrative going all the way back to the Revolution and the militias who fought against the British Army to make America free. The idea of the rifle being used for hunting and for protection against a savage wilderness during the period of pioneers and westward expansion. In our popular culture, even today, we have stories on television and in the movies and in books and on video games that essentially celebrate the use of the gun by heroes to protect what's right against those who use guns to do what's wrong. So there's a very significant cultural relationship that Americans have with the gun. And so one might argue that this is something that makes us very different than Great Britain and Australia, where this kind of gun culture is by no means as persuasive. So in this instance, applying the tests of parallel case reasoning reveals that while there are a number of important similarities between the United States and allies such as Great Britain and Australia that might make a convincing logical case that the kind of public policy regarding gun control in those other nations would work here, there are some important differences that the test of opposition reveals. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that these significant differences we can identify between the United States and the other countries definitively establishes this parallel case argument as illogical and the claim being false. Remember that whenever we're engaging in this kind of logical evaluation of complex public arguments, it's not a question of deciding that the claim is absolutely true or absolutely false, because public argument doesn't work that way. What we do is we establish, here are the logical strengths of this reasoning, here are the logical problems with this reasoning, and we have to determine within the broader context what we think is the most convincing position and to establish our evaluation of the argument on that basis. Okay, in a nutshell, that's how we're going to recognize and evaluate parallel case reasoning. An interesting variant of the parallel case prototype is what ancient Tudor refer to as reciprocity argument. A reciprocity argument asserts a hypothetical relationship between two situations or conditions and implies a mutual dependence between them. So it's slightly different than your garden variety parallel case. As we now know, in parallel case reasoning, what is true for one member of a class will be true for another member of the class, because they are members of the same class. Reciprocity argument is a bit different. In this kind of warrant, if something is true for one member of the class, then it should be true for another member of the class. So it's very close to parallel case reasoning, except it puts an if-then condition on it. We saw an example of this kind of reciprocity reasoning being used in a recent response to President Trump's ABC interview in June of 2019, when he expressed a potential willingness to listen to negative information about a political opponent from a foreign country. Defenders of President Trump's remarks not only were quick to point out that he also said during the same interview that he would also call the FBI and alert them to the communication, but they also pointed to what they held was a very different standard that Democrats were holding President Trump to, in this case, compared to the way that they reacted to a similar situation regarding the Clinton campaign during the 2016 election season. In 2016, the Clinton campaign contracted with a political research firm based in the United States to get opposition research on President Trump. That company employed the services of Christopher Steele, a former agent for British intelligence, who gained information about President Trump from the government of the nation of Ukraine. Here's a point that was raised by Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, responding to the uproar over Trump's recent statements.
I hope my Democrat colleagues will be equally offended by the fact that this actually did happen in 2016, where a foreign agent was paid for by a political party to gather opposition research.
The argument that Graham is making is on the surface rather simple. If Democrats didn't have a hard time with Secretary Clinton getting information from foreign sources against her political opponent in the 2016 campaign, then their outrage over President Trump being willing to do essentially the same thing seems rather inconsistent and hypocritical. However, as we pointed out in a previous video in the series, this reciprocity reasoning is potentially problematic. The reason for this is that the current outrage over President Trump's statement has to do with his willingness to accept information from a foreign government being in direct violation of federal campaign finance laws that prohibit receiving anything from value from a foreign government or agents of that foreign government. Whereas what the Clinton campaign did in 2016 was to pay for a research firm to collect information for them. So they didn't receive anything of value from a foreign government or foreign agents from that government. There was no violation of federal campaign finance law. Now, you can argue that there may be a form of ethical reciprocity in that they should have been treated the same if the outrage is about getting information about your opponents from a foreign source. However, that's not what the outrage is about in this case. In President Trump's situation, the outrage is about being willing to accept something of value from a foreign government in order to influence the results of an election, which is a violation of the law. Reciprocity reasoning, of course, can be used by folks on any point of the political spectrum. Regarding the same situation, President Trump's statement to ABC News, the MSNBC show Hardball featured analysis from a number of figures that were responding in various ways to not only the situation, but the various parties' reactions to that situation. And in this clip, you'll see Hardball host Chris Matthews interviewing a Democratic strategist, both agreeing that the same reciprocity reasoning is applicable in this instance. However, the alleged hypocrisy lies in the lap of the Republican Party.
I'm joined by Michael Steele, former spokesman for the House Speaker John Boehner, and Mika Ouyang, Vice President for the National Security Program at Third Way. Mika, this thing here, first of all, there's no sense of consistency. If this were Hillary Clinton president, if she'd won in the Electoral College, and she was sitting in the White House now and said, oh, yeah, I got help. I'll take help from dirt from the other countries. These guys would be stringing her up.
Well, you remember,
and then they all go like little Sounds of the Lambs now because it's a Republican president, at least a name Republican.
well, you'll remember at the end of the Clinton administration, there was this whole scandal around the idea that the Clinton campaign might have accidentally accepted Chinese campaign contributions.
Yeah.
And the Republicans went nuts. Foreign interference in our elections. How could you possibly do this? And they were incensed about the idea. And now today, when you have foreign governments offering dirt on campaigns, they seem to shrug their shoulders. It's like Donald Trump only wants foreigners in American elections and will try and keep them out of America everywhere else.
It does.
Let's diagram this out, and you'll note that the structure is very similar to the reciprocity argument that Senator Graham made on the same issue. The claim is made that the Republican response to the Trump interview is hypocritical. The data that are provided to support that claim is, first, Republicans were outraged when the 1996 Clinton-Gore campaign nearly accepted campaign money from Chinese donors. And the second data point, Republicans are not seemingly outraged over Trump's willingness to accept campaign opposition information from a foreign country. The warrant that's being offered is what's true of the Republicans' earlier response to the Clinton-Gore situation should be true of the Republicans' current response to the Trump situation. The backing for this warrant is that the allegations against both of these parties are a similar alleged campaign finance violation. Now, it should be noted as a matter of historical fact that in the case of the Clinton-Gore campaign, the information that the money that was being received by Clinton campaign staffers at the event in question turned out to be money from the Chinese government was something that was discovered after the fact. And as soon as the Clinton campaign discovered that that was the source of the money, they immediately returned the money and reported what they found out to the proper authorities. So there was no actual campaign finance violation in this case. But the argument being made by the Democratic analyst on Hardball is that the Republicans were absolutely incensed when the Clinton-Gore campaign almost engaged in this very violation. So why wouldn't they be outraged when President Trump is expressing a willingness not to accidentally violate the law, but actually intentionally violate the law? So in this instance, they point out that the Republican response is hypocritical because the way that they acted in one possible situation of campaign finance violations ought to be the same as their reaction this time. They're not reacting in the same way, and therefore their response is hypocritical. To wrap up these two examples of reciprocity argument, it's important to reinforce that what makes this example from the Hardball episode more logically reasonable from a parallel case standpoint is not, of course, that a Democrat is making the argument as opposed to a Republican making the argument. That's ridiculous. What makes this argument more logically sound is that the two things that are being compared, the Clinton-Gore acceptance of campaign money from Chinese donors, and the hypothetical willingness of President Trump to accept valuable information from a foreign government about a political opponent, those two situations are sufficiently similar to make a comparison. Whereas in the Graham reciprocity argument, the two things that were being compared, the Clinton purchasing of opposition research from a firm that employed a foreign agent, is not the same thing as President Trump hypothetically suggesting that he would accept something of value without paying for it, which would be in violation of campaign finance law. And the contrast between those two examples is a helpful way to start wrapping up this video. Because as we think about parallel case reasoning, we want to remember that if we want to test the claim that what's happening in one case should also happen in another case, we need to test the quality. Do the cases being compared belong to the same class of objects? Secondly, we want to test the quantity. Are the similarities sufficient in number to make a sound comparison? And finally, we need to apply a test of opposition. Are there important differences between the objects that make the proffered comparison unreasonable? And that's parallel case warrants. So if you have any questions about the content of this video, about the examples, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, when we get together next time, we'll check out the 6th and final video in this series about warrant prototypes. We're going to take a look at one that has some important parallels, no pun, well, maybe pun partially intended, important similarities to parallel case arguments, but with a really important difference. We're going to take a look at the prototype of figurative analogy. With that teaser in mind, I'll see you next time.